Welcome to the final Cities at Tufts virtual colloquium for this academic year. I'm Professor Julian Angerman, and together with my research assistants, Ainsley Judge and Max Sebar, and our partners Shareable and the Bar Foundation, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we're delighted to host Dr. Elizabeth Barron. Elizabeth is a professor of environmental geography at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. She's also a visiting scholar here at UEP for this semester. She's trained as an interdisciplinary scholar with degrees in conservation biology, anthropology, forest ecology, and geography. Her research interests centre around the ontological politics of biodiversity conservation and place-based sustainability, with a special interest in how knowledge developed and stewarded in different communities can come together to co-create sustainable relationships and flourishing places, an idea that she calls emplacement. She also continues her work on the sustainable use of wild fungi and chairs the Fungal Use Group at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This work extends to envisioning how fungal biology and ecology can contribute to rethinking conservation politics and practice. Before moving to Norway and starting her current position, she was an assistant and then associate professor at UW Oshkosh and the first associate director of the Sustainability Institute for Regional Transformations. During this academic year, she's on sabbatical to write a book on emplacing sustainability under contract with Nature Springer Press. Elizabeth's talk today is Emplacing Sustainability. Elizabeth, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts.
Thank you so much, Julian. I really appreciate this invitation and gracious introduction. Um, I want to start by just saying Happy Earth Day to everyone, and to mention that Earth Overshoot Day was July 24th last year. That's the day that marks when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in any given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. And this year's Earth Overshoot Day will be announced on June 5th. And I mentioned this interesting statistic to remind us that the challenges that we're facing in sustainability are quite real and quite serious, and that there's a lot of work out there that is excellent, excellent work in this topic. I obviously only have time to discuss a small amount of it today, um, but I do still think that a new conceptual framework is required for sustainability, and that's what I'm going to talk about. This is a framework that we hope is as much a call to action for an ordinary person as a way to organize complex ideas and structures and institutions. We need a conceptual framework that enables the tools of research and knowledge to be accessible, understandable, and available to people wanting to make changes beyond how we all consume and regulate and try to own the earth in different ways. So, in order to give you a sense of the framework and not get too deep into any sort of nuanced element, I've broken the talk today into three sections. First, I'm going to talk about what we are actually now calling the research program in emplacement. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of more detail about the theoretical elements of why we need a new conceptual framework. And then I'll end with giving a few examples of what we're doing in some of the existing projects. So a little bit about the research program. So when I was at UW Oshkosh, I was working with colleagues in the environmental studies department and the geography department, and later at the Sustainability Institute there. And we felt that we wanted to come together to work on sustainability in a new way. None of us have PhDs in sustainability. That's not our official training. And so we also saw this as an opportunity for us to extend ourselves very intentionally into an interdisciplinary space, and also to imagine how to incorporate our students into interdisciplinary training and interdisciplinary work, because our program, environmental studies, is by its nature interdisciplinary. And so we've been thinking a lot about that. And as Julian mentioned, how that works is something that I've been quite interested in for a long time. So we have these sort of what my PhD students have started calling the foundational pieces that we started writing about emplacement. And the first one there you see from 2016 is led by a colleague of mine, Paul Van Auken, and he was writing about Hmong refugees and Hmong resettlement into Wisconsin in the 1970s. And he was thinking about how Hmong people have connected and rebuilt their livelihoods and cultural experiences in Wisconsin and what that looked like. And it became a really great way to think about what it means to become connected to a place, to become emplaced in a new environment. A few years later, we published what is, I would consider to be the sort of keystone piece, the one here in bold. And that's the piece where we were able to lay out the theoretical foundations, which we call the tenets. We'll come back to that later. And then also what this emplacement framework looks like. As you'll notice, that was published in Local Environment. That was a great place for that paper and has been the one that we kind of go back to again and again. And then finally, I was asked to write a chapter thinking about community economies in relation to environmental sociology. And that was a place that I, again, was developing emplaced sustainability as a theoretical concept and thinking about it in relation to post-capitalism. So out of these three original pieces, I would say we started to be able to discuss, and when I say we, I mean those of us that my colleagues at UW Oshkosh mostly. We started to discuss emplaced sustainability kind of in these four main ways. One was that sustainability is a process. So for those of you that may be familiar with Doreen Massey's work on place and space, that was very central to how we were theorizing a new idea about sustainability. And she writes about progressive sense of place as process. So we adapted that to think about sustainability as something that is continually unfolding rather than fixed or determined. We also wanted to write and think about how sustainability actually plays out in the world and that it happens in real places, but it still can work across scales and boundaries and be this kind of flexible, malleable, fluid way of understanding place, but also to have it grounded in a location or some kind of spatial way. We also then started thinking about how, sustainability is really diverse and has a lot of internal conflicts because the reality is, especially coming from the social sciences perspective, that there's not one sustainable future that we are aiming for. We're not going to arrive at a place where the pristine environment is restored, capitalism is secure and green, all the people are finally equal. That's not really how knowledge production is really working, even though we like to think of it like that sometimes. So we need to accept that sustainability is diverse and full of internal contradictions. Hence the need for a sort of discursive dialogical approach that recognizes this fluidity and dynamism. And finally, we wanted to really make it clear that sustainability is not an answer or a unified vision, but is itself a site of disagreement and constructive dialogue. And here I have site in red because we wanted to start thinking about sustainability itself as a place. And that for those of the geographers in the audience, that this is site and place and space and location are all kind of nuanced in how we talk and think in geography. So we got to this point and we thought, wow, this is really cool. And we went and I started sort of talking about this with different folks, and they all said, this seems really interesting. How do you do that? And we thought, oh, yeah, how do you do that? So we need to try to do this. We need to try to operationalize all of this really cool theoretical thinking that we're doing. And so we decided we need some projects. So we went and got some projects, which wasn't more challenging than it sounds, but suffice it to say, the first project that we secured is based in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Emplacing algal blooms to advance sustainability theory and practice. The core focus for this project is how to do interdisciplinary sustainability work in a co-creative ways that take on the very real challenges of those types of collaborations across disciplines and across epistemologies and ontologies that we all learn through our educational experiences. So rather than assuming that projects will work out because everyone has the best intentions, we decided that we would design a project in which we would both study a real world problem, harmful algal blooms in the Winnebago Pool Lakes. And that's the central picture that you see here on the slide, which is a especially bad algal bloom in Lake Winnebago in central Wisconsin. But in addition to that, we would study how the research team worked as a team. And we would look and think and work together to really interrogate our own work process and make a shared commitment to each other to um, try to think about that and to think and work differently. I would just mention that that is all these projects are ongoing. So I will talk about some of our findings, but they're all preliminary. The second project that picked up emplacement thinking is Arctic auditories hydrospheres in the high north. And in this case, I was invited in to the project by my colleague Katrine Losleben. And what's really interesting about this project is it's an environmental humanities project. So whereas in MBAST, we used a sort of social science entry point into a social ecological systems problem, here we're using an environmental humanities entry point that with a focus on listening to nature and listening to the environment to actually think about the theory of emplacement and emplaced sustainability in relation to acoustic ecologies. That's been a really interesting project. We just had our first paper out from that, which is you can see on the slide in progress in environmental geography. And then finally, I've become involved in a project called Mission Mjøsa. This is centered around Lake Mjøsa in southern Norway. So, sorry, just to say the picture on the top left is from northern Norway and Arctic auditories, the area where Arctic auditories is located. And the picture on the bottom left is Lake Mjøsa in southern Norway. And here we have a project that really opened up an opportunity for us to do a comparative study because it's also centered around the lake, like MBAST. It's also a big interdisciplinary project like MBAST. But in this case, the project was initiated by some technological and physical scientists, and they invited the social scientists in. So that's been a very good opportunity for me to think about what it looks like to do place-based research in a different place than in Wisconsin and in a different kind of team, in a different interdisciplinary structure. So those are the three projects that are in development right now. And while I'm on sabbatical, these are the publications that I've been working on in relation to those projects. I now realize this is my first sabbatical, and I now realize that this is a little more than one should take on in a sabbatical. But nonetheless, I'm working with many excellent colleagues on these different things, and they all are interesting and exciting in their own ways. So I'll just mention that the Mission Mjøsa paper from social ecological systems to emplacement in Lake Mjøsa is paired with the MBAST paper that you see from SES to emplacement in Lake Winnebago. And in both of those cases, I'm working with my PhD student, Prima Ranjikar, based at NTNU, um, to think about that. And I'll talk about that later in the sort of what are we doing section of the talk. The two pieces for Arctic auditories are going to be going into an edited volume that we're working on there. But then in MBAST, you see that we also have this edited volume, which is with all of the researchers that are involved in the MBAST project. And the edited volume is itself going to be an outcome of the research package where we are co-creating emplacement together. So that's been a really exciting project I'm working on with my co-PI, Stephanie Spehar, and the entire team there. And then, of course, the monograph, which I actually have been thinking about for a long time, but now starting to sink my teeth into in a new way. And it's part of the reason I decided to talk about the research program more today instead of just the monograph is because with all of these things in play at the same time, it's been a really exciting but also really intense period of thinking about what this work means to different communities and in different places. And so I think that that's mostly what I wanted to share with you. Okay, so finally, in terms of the sort of work program, as you see, things have really kind of organically picked up over the last 5 years or so. And now we're getting to a point where we need to start to have some nuance in the terminology. So I just wanted to take a moment to mention that I am trying to, but not always succeeding in using these terms. And I want to just make it clear to you what I'm trying to communicate. So when I say emplacement thinking, I'm sort of using that as a bit of a catch-all term for more or less everything that I'm talking about today. When I talk about the emplacement framework, that is specifically this work of operationalizing the four domains to support interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary place-based work. And the MBAS project focuses specifically on that emplacement framework. Emplacement is also become widely used amongst ourselves as a catch-all term, but technically it is one of the four domains in the framework. And as I'll mention a little bit more later, it's the one that's sort of the most expansive and radical. And so that's also where we do a lot of our active thinking and work. And finally, we were talking about emplaced sustainability more as the theory that is behind this work, building on theoretical foundations laid out in the core tenets that are being again sort of reworked for the monograph. This is the theory that sustainability is an ongoing political dialogue amongst people and earthkin in places which enacts new forms of community and economy. So that hopefully provides a bit of a groundwork for you about the many different places and pieces and work types of work that we're doing. I want to take a step back now and think about why is a new conceptual framework necessary? Why is it that theoretically and sort of conceptually this is something that we believe and I believe that we need to make space for? So I want to start by backing up just a minute to something that we should all be quite familiar with, which is the starting premise for sustainability. For many of us, this is going to be a very familiar set of figures. Of course, the three pillar model here. This is a different version of the three pillar model where you see sort of nested circles that, in this case, highlights the centrality of the environment and the sort of primacy of the environment, as everything else needs to have a stable environment in order to function. And this has, of course, been merged with what's the Sustainability Development Goals, or the SDGs, in this very well-known wedding cake figure, which again prioritizes the sort of environment SDGs and places the society and economy SDGs sort of within those. This is a figure that's put out by Stockholm Resiliency Center, and interestingly, sort of we're not going to have time to talk about this too much, but has been shown to be problematic in some ways because it prioritizes the SDGs that are getting, unfortunately, the least attention and really struggling, especially post-pandemic. So the point that I want to make with these three figures is that they all represent and demonstrate powerful normative representations of sustainability to such an extent that they have deemed to be sort of accurate representations of reality. And so a lot of sustainability work that is more in the sort of normative and linear frame is looking at these figures and saying, okay, how do we do this better? This is the starting point for a whole wide range of research, which John Law, if you're familiar with his work on what's wrong with the one world world, would call a northern one world metaphysics. And that means, as I said, is that we need to discover what sustainability is, and we need to continue to try to figure out how to do it. In this context, the debates around sustainability become about perspectives, not about what is real. And I want to stop here and say that I think this is a delicate and tricky conversation to have in a time period when so many things that we've understood as real for a long time, like science and education, are under attack. And the opening up this discussion to the idea of worlding can allow in a lot of different worlds, and some that I personally don't want. So I do feel quite a responsibility in talking about, in opening up this particular box. But nevertheless, I think it must be done as a very important perspective and tool for us to be able to have to back up and understand that these images represent a one world metaphysics, specifically coming out of the minority world, and very closely connected to the history of international development and international environmental politics from the 1970s and 80s. So I'm not saying that we should throw this out, but what I am suggesting is that we open ourselves up to the idea that this is one way, but it's not the only way. This is a starting point, it's not the answer. And that these models did not fill knowledge gaps that are now filled. So for many, they are not meant to. They are identified in line with a certain kind of politics. So now I'm going to return to this progressive geographical and social science research that complements my concerns in relation to the three pillars model. So this is the model that Purvis et al. In their 2019 paper traced the history of, which I found that paper very fascinating because I had, like many of us, sort of taken this model as kind of a given and understood that it must be representing a whole lot of really important research and thinking, and that we had sort of settled on this. But they write that the emergence of this particular model, the three pillars model, was in response to various critiques that congealed in the 1970s and 80s, which often centered on how to address economic issues of development and underdevelopment in relation to social and environmental issues. So their conclusion is that the emergence of the three pillar paradigm was primarily a product of the origins of sustainability as a concept, with influence from various actors, more state and public actors like the IUCN and the United Nations, than from academics. What's significant here is that this model emerged without theory or without a conceptual framework, but rather as the product of negotiations, which very quickly became embedded in international development and globalization. So Purvis and colleagues refer to the tensions about how to attend to to the economic pillar as, quote, competing realities. And as I said, this paper was quite eye-opening to me and showed me that it's not only an intention for that it, excuse me, that no one was doing a really good job at integrating these pillars to arrive at this sort of gooey center of sustainability, and that it was actually something that we could interrogate and we could evolve the model itself. So this has led me to really deep dive into the relational literature and in the relational turn on sustainability, and to see that as an opportunity to really start to remake how we understand this three pillar model. So the relational turn, and I'm drawing here mostly from two papers, Patterson et al. 2017 and West et al. 2024. And within this relational turn, they've identified major conceptual frameworks for sustainability transformations, which I'm summarizing here as the social ecological systems, socio-technical transitions, transformative adaptation, and sustainability pathways. And part of what these models have in common are key concepts and approaches, such as those depicted in the diagram on the right, with indigenous kinship relationalities, systematic analytical relationalities, Latin American post-development, post-humanist performative, and structural metabolic. And what they're showing is just a sampling of some of the papers that rest in these different relational frames. The relational turn in sustainability is a multi-worlds perspective, and as such, it conveys sustainability is a dialogue among worlds rather than a set of solutions to be discovered according to one world. This is a really important step in our thinking about sustainability, but it's still engaging with what geographers might call a regressive sense of place. So the future orientations have plurality, relationality, more than human, indigenous knowledges, multi-worlds, all these things that I'm super interested in and want to work with. But when it comes to place, Patterson et al. Identify places of sustainability transformation in social ecological systems as sites of resource governance or locations where interactions between SES components occur. So as sites or locations, these places have identifiable boundaries and elements. So we're talking about things like watersheds, a fishery, a forest, or the biotic and abiotic components within them. They hold instrumental value as natural resources and are relevant for those actors who may benefit from their use. I would suggest that this epistemology of place naturalizes it as fixed in time and space, confining it to a site with identifiable ecological processes and use values to specific human actors. Premising transformations on this regressive epistemology of place, I would argue, limits progressive possibilities to reimagine things like governance, agency, community, and economy, and is at odds with more progressive ontologies of place emerging in the social sciences and sustainability literature in recent years. To get into and work to bring in a more progressive sense of place, in the original 2020 paper, we engaged with these 4 sets of literatures. As you see, each one of these was referenced as a core tenet or sort of key set of theoretical and academic literature that we used to weave into make emplacement. Post-structuralism, social natures, diverse economies, place theory, these are all things that I've been very interested in for a long time. Now, as we move into the sort of next phase of the work and with the monograph and the various papers I showed you before, we're starting to update the theoretical contributions, really bringing in a lot of literature from the relational turn. So this is work that is mostly placed in the monograph, but certainly influencing our other collaborations. And so instead of talking about post-structuralism, now I am thinking about this idea of multi-worlding and pluriverses. This actually came up in Penn's talk a little bit last week as well. But this is a really helpful way of making sure to do due diligence and not just pull everything into one worldview and call them perspectives. So that's something I'm still working on in my own talk, my own way of speaking. Thinking about, instead of just social natures and eco-social futures, now we're talking about ecological belonging and post-capitalist community engagement with Earth kin. This is something that I've started writing about with my PhD student, Elena Weber, and also in the Arctic Auditories piece. From diverse economies, we're moving into talking about constituting the community economy with post-capitalism, and especially in a piece that we're working on right now for an edited volume on place, we are trying to actually start to imagine what an emplaced future could look like. So moving from just applying the domains, which I'll get to in a second, we're actually trying to populate them with our own imaginings and our own hopes. And then finally, place theory is sort of morphing into this discussion about place assemblages that co-constitute community economies. If we take these bodies of critical social theory and remake the 3 pillars model with them, we end up with something that looks like this. And this is very much a work in progress. But for me, it's very helpful to be able to actually populate what I would say is a different kind of worldview of an integrated model with trading out just sort of society, or some people would say justice and equity, with this idea of interdependence, changing out environment or ecology with socio-natures, and changing out economy with community economies, and actually changing out sustainability itself with place. So here we're remaking the pillars to create a theoretical opening to reimagine their intersection as place and make space for this place assemblage. And this is the kind of underlying worldview, I would say, that is the starting point for emplacement. So how are we getting from place then to emplacement or emplaced sustainability? First, we're thinking about emplacement as a conceptual framework for a relational approach to sustainability transformations with a progressive sense of place. So we've added place into that conversation happening in the relational turn. Emplacement is allowing us to incorporate various elements and key concepts from existing relational frameworks, but integrate them into new ways. And we can write about the theory of emplaced sustainability now as a place for the radical potential for sustainability transformations embodied by the emplacement domain and grounded in ecological belonging, post-capitalist political engagement with earth kin, place assemblage, and a remaking of governance, bringing those elements together in a community economy. Okay, so I keep mentioning the domains of the emplacement framework, and I want to present those to you now using the terms that we have used in our projects. So if you're looking for more sort of academic speak about what these domains are, I would direct you to the papers. But when we have tried to now operationalize the domains, we have started to reframe them in what I think is a much more accessible way for thinking with the domains. And I'll show you how we do this in just a minute. The domain of displacement has was originally about what was lost that made a system unsustainable, with this assumption that most systems at some point had sustainability within them, what went out of whack or what sort of went out of alignment. But now we think about it as just what's missing, what has been lost. These are meant to be very open questions for us to just ruminate on, to kind of reflect on. Misplacement was originally sort of conceptualized as what is it that has come into the system that is allowing it to function but actually is unsustainable? And we have reframed this to talk about what uneasy alliances have been made, why and with what effects. The domain of replacement was originally pretty closely aligned with restoration ecology and sort of reframing movements such as local consumption movements and these kinds of sort of attempts to remake sustainability. But now we just want to ask, whose place is it to suggest who is it that is involved in this remaking process? And finally, the emplacement domain, which I've talked a fair bit about now, is about what kind of future do we want for this place? Written and discussed in this way, hopefully it begins to become clear that these questions should be quite accessible and quite open and not direct us towards any specific worldview or specific um, voice that maybe there was some bias towards in the original framing. Okay, so what are we actually doing? So one of the reasons that we rewrote the domain names was because, excuse me, the domain sort of concepts was because I realized that we needed to be able to activate them and use them for something. And one of the first things that we used them for was this Arctic Owls writing project. This is from the Arctic Auditories Project, and here in the winter of 24-25, we worked with the domains with a group of artists and writers to imagine and reimagine the future Arctic. So we took a 5-month writing program where we took one domain each month, and through a series of really thoughtful pieces, we all tried to engage with a series of writing prompts that I had created, a series of um, artistic sort of starting points for everyone to reflect on. We had two groups in this project, one in Norwegian and one in English. And the groups produced stories, poetry, film, and images, and recordings. And then we all presented to each other and discussed them. The piece on the right here is called The Red Fish by Alicia Marzano, and she submitted this for the session on displacement. This was a piece that generated a lot of interest, and we had a lot of discussion about it. One of the things that you'll note is that she has done a really careful work here to both engage with the photograph that she took and then also to then write poetry around it, using quotes and thinking about actually what is trash. So it may or may not be apparent to you, since this is a Zoom call, you have a pretty good view there of the image. That's not a fish. It's a biscuit wrapper for sort of common brand of cookies sold in northern Norway. And she captured that and reflected on how displacement is as much about what we need to grapple with that's coming into our place, and the fish that are now sort of missing can they be replaced with trash? So we had this really interesting discussion about if that's okay and what that seems like that works for the future of the Arctic. In spring of 2025, I adapted the OWL's writing methodology for the MBAST project, but in this case with a somewhat different objective. So where Arctic Owls was an attempt to engage people with different imaginaries of the Arctic, to imagine an emplaced future Tromsø, the group really connected in that work. In MBAST, the group was already connected. But in Arctic Owl, several people spoke about how the process was personally transformative for them in their relationship to place. So I thought this could really maybe work as a method for our MBAS team to engage in some personal reflection on place and identity, to center our work on co-creation as a new form of interdisciplinary engagement. A key difference here, as I said, is that the group in Lake Owls has been working together for a few years. They're on the research project together, and many of them and us lived in Oshkosh and for many, many years. So we're still processing through this material, some of which will be in the edited volume. But I just wanted to pull out a couple of quotes that I think are really reflective of the process. So here, one of our colleagues says, "I feel unfit to write much about this displacement in this case, because to me, displacement is about personal relationships with place. And I've spent the better part of the last 20 years not building a personal relationship with the WPL or the Winnebago Pool Lakes." And what's very interesting about this case is that here's somebody who actually has been living and working in the region and relatively close, but has been commuting and not living specifically in that town. So thinking about how big a place is and what it means to us. Another colleague writes, "Uneasy alliances that can rise in the context of the Winnebago Pool Lake system and in general for a lake system are environmentalists versus recreational users and tourists, farmers versus water quality scientists or NGOs, and three, local communities versus state and federal management." Here, I think this is interesting because this is a colleague writing, as you see, about uneasy alliances or misplacement. And here, she's really focusing on some of the social dimensions, but all that connect to the environment. So I think it's really important to maintain a connection to these very tangible institutions and material processes in the area as well. And then finally, emplacement reflections. What shifts of mind, heart, but also perhaps most importantly, relationships are required? A word that comes to my mind is solidarity. And for me, this is an important quote because it connects emplacement to a political project of solidarity, which is something that can be really critical moving forward. Okay, and then my final example is from the work from thinking from social ecological systems to emplacement. And this is about reframing governance using the emplacement framework. So here we're using theory coming out and Ostrom's work on social ecological systems analysis to determine a sort of empirical baseline for the social and ecological dimensions of both systems, where the resource is the lake itself and the water in the lake system. And so in these projects, we are asking this, how do you govern a place and its resources under changing conditions? And in both cases, then we're using an emplacement analysis to build on that. And this is the first time that we are using emplacement as a sort of tool to try to imagine and enact visions of emplacement. So we changed, or not necessarily changed, but we built on the social ecological system, this emplacement thinking, to ask what is governance itself when you understand place as an assemblage and governance as a set of ethical practices to enact community economies. This involves visualizing actors involved in the wastewater and agricultural arenas differently and imagining these beings and entities as interdependent in and around and with the system, influencing the lakes in the past, present, and future. Could think about how in their own efforts to either root or escape, that others' efforts to engage or reject elements of the lake system and begin to embrace or reject these processes of becoming emplaced. And in so doing, we see material and discursive elements that demand understanding and action from others, and therein these moments of negotiation and interaction that we would call governance in the system. Okay, so a few takeaways from the talk today. First, that we, across the emplacement sort of thinking, really have this emphasis on sustainability as a dialogue, not a solution. Second, that in remaking the three-pillar Venn diagram to engage relational and transformative thinking, we have also transformed this sort of abstract and somewhat a theoretical concept of sustainability into place, and that makes those more abstract and relational ways of thinking actionable because they are grounded. Third, the concept of place activates multiscalar engagement to enact a post-capitalist politics and emplaced sustainabilities that center co-creation and ethical concerns. We need to sort of decenter the idea of sustainability as an emergent property of scientific discovery. Focusing on dialogue and engagement across worlds starts to become as abstract as the SDGs. So all of this really great literature and thinking about knowledge production still needs to be grounded, following a sort of Western metaphysics that we want to reject as a sole world that we are living in. So I do that by engaging with progressive sense of place to remake sustainability into something real and be grounded in complex but also multi-world places. But finally, I don't want to let go of the social ecological systems either, because it provides some very important information about how one way of understanding the world and also the institutions and also the social structures that are very real and very present in our day-to-day engagement, especially in policy and at the science policy interface. And so I want to just end by saying that it's important to not jettison that work. Finally, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, Stephanie Spehar and the MBAS team, Katrine, Paula, and those at Arctic Auditories, Elena and Prima, my PhD students in NTNU, who have been really getting into this and pushing my own thinking quite a bit. Everyone that participated in OWLS, my colleagues at the Community Economies Institute and the Community Economies Research Network, and UW-Madison Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, where I've also been working this year, and at Tufts University Department of Urban and Ecological Planning. There are some logos from where we've gotten our funding and information about how to find me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What an interesting, and expansive, and both deeply theoretical but intensely practical presentation. We got several questions. Gary says, in an era when 7 out of 9 planetary thresholds have been exceeded, does Emplaced Sustainability capture the need for radical reductions in environmental destruction, degrowth, system, parentheses, capitalism change?
Wow, Gary. Thank you for your question. I would like to suggest to you that it does. And the reason for me that it does is this is really going back to my diverse economies training. If you, for those of you that may not have noticed right away, all my talk about community economies and diverse economies, this is coming from my training in diverse economies literature and theory from J.K. Gibson Graham. Their original book that they published from 1996 was called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It. And in that book, one of the things that made such a big impression on me was the way that they talked about the feminist movement and the way that the feminist movement was as much about individual people affecting their own lives and their own changing their own relationships in the household as it was about major structural changes in policy and in practice. And so for me, this is also an important way to think about sustainability. That it's about as, and this is where it goes to the work with the owls and spending time in these writing groups, that it's as much about remaking our own understanding of sustainability, making space for other ways of knowing and ways of being, and taking that in as something that we need to allow ourselves to change, not just change our light bulbs and change our bags at the grocery store, but fundamentally change how we relate to each other and to the world around us. And that is equally as important, I would suggest, as radical policy change and radical institutional restructuring that is important in those policy spaces. But if we can't just assume that, and it's easy to do this, that the policy spaces, which is where those things like the planetary boundaries are being discussed, is where the work should be, and that we should leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Ignacio from southern Chile, Mapuche territory says, interesting contrast between real and prefigurative. Can you expand on that? Could these in actuality be entwined in a way that expands our definition of the real?
Oof. Hi, Ignacio. Thanks for coming, first of all. Um, that is an interesting question. You know, I've really struggled with thinking about the real and about diverse ontologies and ontological politics, partially because I used to take it quite literally. And I really was challenged with this idea of, for example, multi-species ethnography, or, does the tree speak? Is the river alive? All these kinds of philosophical questions that we can really spend a lot of time on and engage with in very deep thought and discussion. What I want to say for your question is that, and this really draws on our community economies work, right? That we can choose every day how we engage with what is real and what is not real. And partially what becomes real is how we live and make those choices, in this sort of social reproduction of society in different ways, and to make space to shift, as I said just now in the other question, actually, also what we engage with as real. Now, with that said, my problem with a lot of this work is that it somehow seems to allow us to say, oh, I'm just going to decide that the biodiversity crisis isn't real, right? So for myself, the way that I have addressed that is to, and I have a background in ecology, as Julian mentioned, still engage with my scientific colleagues and what they see as real, and try to think about what are the effects of these different perspectives and these different worlds. And that's where the community economies really helps me, because it gives me an ethical framework to compare those effects to, so that I can then also decide, I see the effects and I think these effects are unjust. I see these effects and I see that these effects lead to um, things that are more just, or systems that are more expansive or more open. Maybe that is at least a start to an answer to your question.
Great, thanks. Kelly asks, or makes the point, appreciating how complex this is, can you say something about how community economies might work in areas that are resource poor?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a great question. I would say that one of the community economies work, a lot of it comes out of areas that are resource poor, because it shows that when we think about the economy, there's a lot more there than capitalist exchange, and where people are selling their labor power as the only thing that they have to engage in an economic process, which is almost by definition set up to exploit them. So in this case, it's been actually, I would say, just as a small aside, more challenging for me to understand the community economy in Norway, in an area that is resource rich, than in, for example, Wisconsin, where I lived, where I was involved in a lot of different things that supported areas that were resource poor. Or if you see around the world, actually, a lot of examples where people find ways to care for each other and to support each other, which are actually working very well. Now, it's not to say that they couldn't benefit from more resources or that there are places that don't need more. But I think people find a way to, for example, in the gift economy, in the sharing economy, and in childcare is a huge area where we see a lot of sort of resources and non-monetary labor being mobilized. Oh, excuse me. So the other aspect of that, I would say, is that this is where we can really look to see from other worldviews what we think resources are and what the resources are that people that have lived in places for a long time understand and can use to live successfully in those areas.
Great, thanks. Um, so one thing that I want to ask you, you mentioned the word equity, but you didn't really mention the word justice. How does justice play out? Because I'm thinking of this elegant idea, and I'm thinking, how does this play out in some of the redlined neighborhoods in urban America, or some of the poorer parts of Trondheim or Oslo?
Yeah, thank you for that, Julian. I think that this is a question that we haven't tackled yet when in our emplacement thinking. Just in the last year, I would say we started to talk more intentionally about how emplacement intersects or connects with Indigenous knowledges.
Yeah.
And especially in the 2025 paper, we went to some length to read Indigenous scholarship and to see how our work was intersecting or collaborating, or I wouldn't say that we found any examples where it was refuting or going against. Um, but that in the relational turn literature, it's also discussed quite a bit how much um, danger there is in overstepping into other areas of scholarship. And I would say that for me, actually reading more into the environmental justice literature, some of your work, Bob Bullard's work, and understanding the work that's already happening there is
Yeah.
actually this important starting point to think about where could there be a useful intersection with this work that we're doing in emplacement, which has for certainly initiated in relation to natural resources discourse and is slowly making its way into different areas of environmental and discourse.
Great. Final question from E.D. Pontius. Elizabeth, how do we balance understandable Indigenous interest in traditional practices, hunting, fishing, against critical ecosystem damage and human health concerns?
Ooh. Well, um, yeah, so in this case, I would actually lean on my work with the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I haven't talked about at all today. But between 2018 and 2022, I was part of the IPBES Sustainable Use Assessment. And your question is very much in line with the work that we did there, which was to take a considerable amount of time to meet with Indigenous people from many different communities across many different continents and set up a series of listening sessions. And I was not part of that work, but some of the people in my team were. And then we figured out we thought about, I'm not sure if we figured it out, but we thought quite a lot about how to incorporate the needs and voices from those different communities into a system which is very much representing a Northern One World metaphysics. It is not helpful necessarily for me to think about the practices and politics of Indigenous communities in some way, in the way that your question is worded, in conflict with the environmental crises that we're having, but as also happening in relation to what is happening in the environment, and that those practices need to be given special attention because, like we talk about a lot of countries in the majority world not being responsible for the climate crisis, but bearing disproportionate effects of the climate crisis, we could find some analogies, I think, with Indigenous communities and their use of nature as well. in this situation.
Great. And the very last question from Chris, would you call this a great social experiment as much as a scientific one?
Oh, this being emplacement,
I'm
I
assuming that. Chris, are you there, Chris? I'm assuming he
yeah,
means.
I would assume so as well. And I would say that social for humanity. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we can separate those things, Chris. I think that we are in a period in the world where we just need to buckle down and take some things seriously. And one of those is how we behave socially in relation to the world that we live in, you know? And, I see a lot of this work in many ways as actually me and my colleagues just trying to make sense of the world that we are living in and do the best that we can to contribute to what I hope is a better way of being. So, I mean, I was motivated to get into the to academic work through an understanding that it was possible to be an activist scholar and that it is very important to um, observe what is happening around me and take it seriously and reflect on it in a complex way, not in an overly simplified way. So if we want to call it an experiment, sure, I would love to see an experiment in everybody taking time to think about their place and learning where they're from and their relationships and embedding themselves a little more. I think that'd be great.
Great. Well, lots to talk about, lots to think about, Elizabeth. Really looking forward to seeing this book project come to fruition. Um, can we give a warm round of applause for Elizabeth Barron, the final speaker for this semester? So have a great summer, everybody, and look forward to seeing you in the fall with another great raft of speakers. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.